In this brief video, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some primary sources. Really here, all I'm going to do is talk about some aspects of the general nature of primary sources, and then just talk about the Old Testament primary sources for understanding Second Temple Judaism. And other videos, I'll talk about other primary sources, such as the Apocrypha and Josephus and Philo and whatnot. But right now, we'll just look at a couple of things here with the Old Testament. So we'll begin here, first of all, by noticing that one needs to understand that primary sources that were written during this period evolved. That is, there's not really a time when a person just sits down and, picks up a piece of papyri and some kind of writing instrument and just starts composing. But what happens is people are bringing together materials. So things are being written, and people have access to things that are being written, and then copies them, writes them down again, and adds, as it were, other things. So they have an evolution. And so, different sources that we think of, we might have the idea of one person sat down. Well, that's not really what happened. Someone has some material, writes it, gets more material, writes it, puts it together. So it's evolved. And sometimes what we have is interpolation, and that is there may be one author who has written one thing down, but then somebody else comes later on and wants to add to that material. And so they insert, as were, materials in something, not just adding it on, but they actually put the material inside of it. And so it becomes longer. So, and we can sometimes detect that material has been interpolated when we see that it recognizes events or conditions that existed at a later time than what a previous work was likely to have been written. So sometimes primary sources are interpolated, and so when you look at a source, First Enoch would be a good example here. First Enoch has an evolution. There were times in which different parts of it were written in different decades or even centuries, and then things get added into it. And so as well, you have a period of redaction. So editors, people who have this, scribes, copyists, have these materials, and then as they are reading them, oftentimes in a different context, in a different culture, and trying to best explain or try to remove confusion, to provide clarification. Editors will add information, they subtract, sometimes they take away things, or they will rewrite a phrase, they'll reword certain things. They might even reorganize a document, put things in different orders. And so redaction is a thing that's also occurring with our primary sources. So whenever you want to look at a source that you think is telling you something about the Second Temple period, you've got to remember that source could be interpolated or it could be redacted by someone who is living at a later time than when that document may have first have been composed. So primarily, just look here at the Hebrew and Greek Old Testament. So, of course, the vast majority of what we refer to as the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. So sometimes it's referred to as the Hebrew Bible. There are portions of Daniel and Esther and a few little places elsewhere that is written in Aramaic. So this language that developed, during the Persian period that the Jews adopted and started using. But we also have a significant development during the Seleucid period, or during the Ptolemaic period, I should say, where the um, Jewish scriptures were then copied into Greek, or translated, I should say, into Greek. And so that's the Septuagint. So that Roman numeral LXX um, um, is referring to that source. Basically, uh, the literature, the scriptures that were considered somehow or another authoritative for the how Jews should live or believe is divided basically up between Torah, prophets, and the writings. So we see this expression being used to refer to the scriptures that help to form what many Jews, not all Jews, because different Jews have different views about the prophets and the writings in particular. Um, so later on, the rabbis, so this is really after time after um, the Second Temple Jewish period, tended to recognize the authority of scriptures with the description of that which defiles the hands. So that may be a kind of an odd description for us. How can something that's holy defile the hand? But it defiles the hand in the sense that if you touch something that is holy, then you need to wash your hands, as it were, before you touch something that is unclean. Or you certainly wash your hands as well, in terms of recognizing ritual purity, before you touch something that is holy. So this was a kind of a rabbinic way of making a distinction between writings that were not considered authoritative in terms of telling Jews what God wants or revealing something truthful about God, and those that were considered the writings of other people. So there are three forms of the Hebrew. We have what we call the Masoretic text. So today, most people who are reading out of an English, Bible, they are reading um, a translation that is primarily off of what we call the Masoretes. The Masoretes were people who were copyists during the Middle Ages, basically, and so our Hebrew text we have is due to the Masoretes, these copyists, and so we refer to the Hebrew text as a Masoretic text. But then, of course, comes the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which also has biblical text, and so that's also in the form of Hebrew. We also then have the Samaritan Pentateuch. So we can make comparisons between what may have been in earlier forms of the Hebrew version of the Bible. Of course, we may want to kind of abandon the idea of an original in terms of something that was once written and composed and always existed in some kind of pristine, unadulterated, or untouched. Because there's always this evolution, always this interpolation, always this redacting that is going on. So, but these are Masoretic texts, Dead Sea Scrolls, Samaritan Pentateuch, kind of help us to see something of the diversity of the way in which biblical texts were rendered. So some of the people, some particular books that are helpful is the book of Ezra, probably composed somewhere around 400 BCE. I'm going to give that date. It recounts the return of exiled Jews or Judeans to Jerusalem, and as they restore a pre-exilic institutions. So another thing, before they were exiled, the kind of institutions, the religious practices that they believed happened before they were taken off, and particularly trying to get as well practices that conform to Torah, conform to what the reading of the law. We also have Nehemiah, again around 400 BC, and it's depicting the third stage of the reconstruction of Jerusalem, destroyed by the Babylonians under Nehemiah, who led one of the groups So there were several groups that came out of Babylon. Not all Jews, not all Judeans left Babylon. Many continued to stay there. And a community of Judeans continued to thrive and do their work. But many did decide to come back. And the other one I'm just going to mention right here is the book of Daniel. Of course, I could mention other sources, but I'm just going to mention these three right now as a part of an introduction to all this. Is what Daniel is doing. This book is sanctioning Jewish sages in foreign courts, because that's what Daniel is. He's a Judean sage in a foreign court, and advocating that teaching that prosperity and protection, God's protection, is going to follow faithfulness. So when you have stories about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, or Daniel in the lion's den, here we have these stories of people who have integrity. They're not going to do something that violates some kind of integrity, some kind of understanding, especially when it comes to idolatry. Anything associated with idolatry is ultimately taboo. And so a person might not be protected from, excuse me, being thrown into the fire or being thrown into the lion's den, but there is this divine presence with those who are treated in this way. So the book of Daniel is advocating this compliance to Torah, particularly on the issue of avoiding idolatry, since that's the number one huge sin. Stay away from idols. Because the book of Daniel was written at a time when, under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, he was trying to advocate Jews, trying to get rid of this singular worship of Yahweh at the exclusion of the worship of other gods, particularly Antiochus gods or other gods, and to try to make Jews more Hellenistic in accepting and welcoming, recognizing the worship of other gods and joining and participating in that. So anyway, I'll leave it right there for some of the biblical books that are good for Second Temple Judaism. There are, of course, others that were written during this time, which are also helpful. But we'll look at other books written at this time and other videos.